And Solomon, my son, learn to know the God of your ancestors intimately. Worship and serve him with your whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord sees every heart and knows every plan and thought. And he specifically addresses Solomon because Solomon's going to be king. And perhaps even because this part right here, that was all about, the promise God made to David. That was specifically regarding Solomon. If he continues to obey my commands and regulations. But David also recognizes it's not just a monotonous drudge work sort of attitude, because that's a real easy way to just slip into complacency and boredom and be like, is this really even worth it? So yeah, it's a full-on commitment, not just alright, let me make sure I've checked all the boxes today. What's up, cool people? My name's Matt. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alrighty. So we're at 1 Chronicles 28. So, long story short, with 1 Chronicles, and probably 2nd as well, it's a whole lot of recap. With the intention, it was originally written and addressed to the exiles from Israel, especially those in the Babylonian Empire, and just kind of a call to set things right by way of saying, all right, here's what happened, here's how we got to this situation, and then kind of being like, all right, now let's set this right. So the last fair number of chapters have been all about the temple being built, or not the actual building of it yet, but like preparations for it, realignment of duties, once it is built, and just all sorts of things surrounding that, which, yes, were covered before in somewhere in the 2nd Samuel to 1st Kings range of things. But that's kind of, especially after Solomon's reign, but even a bit before that, is kind of where things started to get messed up a little bit. Actually, things were debatably messed up all along. Like, not even that long after God made the covenant with Israel and all that. But I digress. We've gotten past the duty realignment chapters, and now that's kind of where we're at with 1 Chronicles 28. So let's hop in and see what David's instructions to Solomon are here. David summoned all the officials of Israel to Jerusalem, the leaders of the tribes, the commanders of the army divisions, the other generals and captains, the overseers of the royal property and livestock, the palace officials, the mighty men, and all the other brave warriors in the kingdom. David rose to his feet and said, "My brothers and my people, it was my desire to build a temple where the Ark of the Lord's covenant, God's footstool, could rest permanently. I made the necessary preparations for building it, but God said to me, 'You must not build a temple to honor my name, for you are a warrior and you have shed much blood.' Yet the Lord, the God of Israel, has chosen me from among all my father's family to be king over Israel forever. For he has chosen the tribe of Judah to rule, and from among the families of Judah he chose my father's family. And from among my father's sons the Lord was pleased to make me king over all Israel. And from among my sons, for the Lord has given me many, he chose Solomon to succeed me on the throne of Israel and to rule over the Lord's kingdom. He said to me, 'Your son Solomon will build my temple and its courtyards, for I have chosen him as my son, and I will be his father. And if he continues to obey my commands and regulations as he does now, I will make his kingdom last forever.'" Seems like David's speech is going to go on for a while here, so I'll pause and give some of my thoughts on the verses here, as well as look into this little note, which the Hebrew technically says commanders of thousands and of hundreds. That's just another way, really, of understanding that they were generals and captains. The translators for this version, I think, were focused a bit more on intent than exact wording. So, generals and captains probably gives a pretty accurate sense still of their respective ranks. But, anyway, so, David got a whole bunch of the officials together, like, basically anybody who was any kind of important and would be directly impacted, you know, have their work directly impacted by the changing of kings. And or the building of the temple. So he's telling them he wanted to build it, but God said he shouldn't because he's a warrior and he has shed much blood. Not to mention, God didn't directly say this to him, I don't think, but, you know, when the promise was made to David that, or when he was told he couldn't be the one to build the temple, but also was promised a dynasty, between that time and, you know, the time at which he's doing this, there's been a bunch of preparation going on, including, like, defeating enemies near them. So, there's, you know, there were also some preparations to be made and just things that weren't ready yet for the temple to be built. And, you know, he's explaining how he was chosen to rule as king, and was even directly told that his son Solomon should be the one to build the temple. And then, you know, if things continue to go well afterwards, then God says, quote, I will make his kingdom last forever, him being Solomon. But, again, that's if he continues to obey my commands and regulations. This is not saying that God's favor is conditional, but, you know, there are consequences when we do things wrong. And, you know, the fact that, you know, pre-Jesus at least, God's relationship with his people was kind of more based on the law and the commandments. Not that it's completely, not that we should completely ignore all of those laws and commands today, but, you know, our status with God isn't as heavily predicated upon that, because Jesus paid the price for our imperfections. Anyway, okay. On to verse 8, David is still addressing the people here, the officials. So now, with God as our witness, and in the sight of all Israel, the Lord's assembly, I give you this charge. Be careful to obey all the commands of the Lord your God, so that you may continue to possess this good land, and leave it to your children as a permanent inheritance. And Solomon, my son, learn to know the God of your ancestors intimately. Worship and serve him with your whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord sees every heart and knows every plan and thought. If you seek him, you will find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. So take this seriously. The Lord has chosen you to build a temple as his sanctuary. Be strong and do the work. So, yeah, thus seems to end his speech. And right after this part that we talked about here, about following the commands, and then things go well, he's like, okay, yeah, well, since God specifically said that, like, y'all should be careful to, look, right there, be careful to obey all the commands of the Lord your God. Because God said, this only holds up if you obey my commands. And he specifically addresses Solomon because Solomon's going to be king. And perhaps even because this part right here, that was all about, the promise God made to David, that was specifically regarding Solomon. If he continues to obey my commands and regulations. So yeah, Solomon especially needed to be careful with that. But David also recognizes it's not just a, kind of monotonous drudge work sort of attitude that should be approached with this, or that Solomon should approach it with. Because that's a real easy way to just slip into complacency and boredom and be like, is this really even worth it? But it's more of a heart issue. Worship and serve him with your whole heart and a willing mind. So yeah, it's like, it's a full-on commitment, not just a, alright, let me make sure I've checked all the boxes today. Okay. So then after David gives his speech, we move on to verse 11. Then David gave Solomon the plans for the temple and its surroundings, including the entry room, the storerooms, the upstairs rooms, the inner rooms, and the inner sanctuary, which was the place of atonement. David also gave Solomon all the plans he had in mind for the courtyards of the Lord's temple, the outside rooms, the treasuries, and the rooms for the gifts dedicated to the Lord. The king also gave Solomon the instructions concerning the work of the various divisions of priests and Levites in the temple of the Lord. Those would be the past, 5-ish chapters. Anyway, and he gave specifications for the items in the temple that were to be used for worship. David gave instructions regarding how much gold and silver should be used to make the items needed for service. He told Solomon the amount of gold needed for the gold lampstands and lamps, and the amount of silver for the silver lampstands and lamps, depending on how each would be used. He designated the amount of gold for the table on which the bread of the presence would be placed, and the amount of silver for other tables. And it's going to keep talking more about that, but, so, he makes this general address, saying that, or I guess, mentally preparing these leaders and officials for building the temple. And then he specifically gives Solomon the plan, the master plan, the blueprint, whatever you want to call it. All of his detailed thoughts and directions on how all these things would be built and what they're used for and all that kind of stuff. Which, there's a lot of detail in there. Now, this just says that David gave Solomon the plans. I imagine it was like he physically handed Solomon all the, any sort of writings or documentation that he had made about all of this. Sure, he might have also given it orally at that moment, but it's still better to have it in writing, so then it's, easy to go back to that in case Solomon forgets any of the details. And I imagine as we continue reading further in the chapter, there will be more details that it mentions that David passes along to Solomon. But before I just skip right past this, let me look at this note here. Rather than reading, David also gave Solomon all the plans he had in mind, it could read, David also gave Solomon all the plans of the Spirit that was with him. Which brings in a little more of a sense of God's direction in the matter, rather than it just being David's plans without God's input. But in any case, it's still the same general intent. It's like, all right, here are the plans for the temple, including all these different rooms and all these, like, tools, instruments, furniture, things like that. I think we're at verse 17. And I'll probably just wrap up the chapter. David also designated the amount of gold for the solid gold meat hooks used to handle the sacrificial meat, and for the basins, pitchers, and dishes, as well as the amount of silver for every dish. He designated the amount of refined gold for the altar of incense. And finally, he gave him a plan for the Lord's chariot, the gold cherubim, whose wings were stretched out over the ark of the Lord's covenant. Every part of this plan, David told Solomon, was given to me in writing from the hand of the Lord. Then David continued, "Be strong and courageous and do the work. Don't be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. He will see to it that all the work related to the temple of the Lord is finished correctly. The various divisions of priests and Levites will serve in the temple of God. Others with skills of every kind will volunteer, and the officials and the entire nation are at your command." I imagine Solomon isn't the only one given plans for the temple here. He might be the one that got, like, all of the plans. But, you know, in order for the others to work effectively, they kind of have to know the plan for at least their part of the work. So, yeah. That's probably some of what he's getting into down here in verse 21. God may also give them the vision, at least the leadership in those efforts, that vision. But I guess David's comments down here also go a bit beyond just the temple building and, you know, extend into what's going to happen in the temple afterwards, which honestly is part of the vision. So that's also helpful to know. Let's see here. So, note here at the gold cherubim. Hebrew can say, for the gold cherub chariot. So, if I recall correctly, the Ark of the Covenant already had cherubim as part of, like, the cover. So now you're going to have, like, cherubim over top of cherubim. Perhaps signifying, like, an extra level of significance at the very least, or even of, like, God's presence. And or protection over the Ark of the Covenant to an extent. Note there says, could be, was written under the direction of the Lord. So every part of this plan was written under the direction of the Lord, rather than it being actually directly physically written by the Lord. Which, the way it's written in the note there seems a little bit more realistic. Not that it can't happen. I mean, God has the power to directly write things. In fact, the way it's worded in Exodus when they get the Ten Commandments, I'm pretty sure it's like, no, the Lord wrote this. But in any case, the point is, either way, that, again, this is not David's plan and just his own brain working out all these details for the temple. This is coming from God, which is all the more reason for Solomon to follow those plans. Okay, and that's about all the more thoughts I have on 1 Chronicles chapter 28. Okay, so I know I kind of said before in 1 Chronicles about, like, David doing everything he could to prepare for the temple being built. Well, I guess now he's done preparing. And so he's handing things off to Solomon, handing the throne over to Solomon, and that'll, make the transition complete, kind of. There's one last thing, I think just one last thing in the next chapter, but I do think some of these details were not necessarily mentioned in the previous part, whether it was 2 Samuel or 1 Kings or whatever, where, David kind of passed the torch. So, yes, this is meant to be sort of a recap, but there's also some added details. So, maybe at some point, eventually, probably after I get through the whole Bible first, though, at some point I might actually sit and, like, sort of compare which book says what, like, which telling says which things about temple preparations, or, David handing things off to Solomon or whatever. But I digress. As always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Make sure you look down in the description for links to social media pages, Discord server, supporter page, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all sorts of stuff. It's all down there. And of course, down below that, you can leave your thoughts and questions in the comments section. So that's going to do it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you soon for another video. But whatever the case is, till next time, stay cool, people.